If someone had told me 10 years ago that Julian Vance would become the axis my world tilted on, I would have laughed. Not a real laugh, but that tight, nervous sound I made whenever I felt cornered. Because back then, Julian was not a person. He was a weather system, a low-pressure front that moved into a room and made the air feel thin, charged with the promise of a storm. He was my best friend Sam's older brother, a figure carved from shadow and teenage scowls, and he was the secret, terrifying cornerstone of my entire adolescence. My life, by contrast, was built on routine. It was a fortress of quiet predictability. I woke at 6:30. I drank my tea while reading 5 pages of whatever classic I was slogging through. I walked the same route to my university classes. My world was a carefully curated collection of straight lines and right angles, a place where surprises were not welcome. Surprises were dangerous. They were variables in an equation I had worked very hard to solve. Sam's house was the one approved deviation. It was a place of comfortable chaos, of video games left paused, and pizza boxes on the coffee table. It was my second home, a place where I could breathe out. But even there, a shadow lingered in the corners. The shadow of Julian. He was 4 years older, and in the grand, dramatic theater of youth that might as well have been a century, he existed in a different sphere of existence, one populated by late nights, the smell of engine oil, and a quiet, unnerving confidence that felt like an accusation. He rarely spoke to me. A clipped nod in the hallway, a grunt of acknowledgement if Sam forced an introduction. To him, I was an accessory. I was Sam's friend, Leo, a piece of furniture that occasionally occupied his couch. And I was fine with that. Or, I told myself I was. It was safer to be invisible. Because to be seen by Julian Vance felt like standing in the full glare of the sun. You would be illuminated, yes, but you would also, most certainly, be burned. I observed him from a distance, the way an amateur astronomer might track a distant, volatile star. I knew the sound of his heavy work boots on the hardwood floor. I knew the specific way he held a coffee mug, his large, calloused hands wrapped around the ceramic as if it might shatter. I saw the tension he carried in his shoulders, a permanent brace against a world I couldn't imagine. He was a puzzle I was too afraid to solve, a book written in a language I didn't understand, but desperately wanted to learn. The distance between us was a chasm, dug by my fear and cemented by his indifference. He was the confident, physically present older brother. I was the quiet, introspective hanger-on. He was all solid matter. I was mostly anxious energy. We were 2 different species occupying the same territory by a quirk of fate, and the unspoken rule was that we did not interact. We orbited. He was the sun, and I was a forgotten moon, content with my borrowed, second-hand light. This was the status quo, a comfortable, lonely, predictable state of being, and I had no reason to believe it would ever change. Routine was my armor. Solitude was my shield. And Julian Vance was a war I had no intention of fighting. The disruption, when it came, didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived with a drip. A slow, rhythmic plink, plink, plink from my apartment's kitchen ceiling. A spreading water stain that looked like a sickly brown continent growing across the plaster. It was the kind of mundane disaster that feels monumental when your life is built on avoiding them. My landlord, a man whose primary skill was shrugging, informed me it would be a week. At least. Just stay with me, Sam had said, slinging an arm over my shoulder with the easy affection that always made my chest ache a little. It'll be like a permanent sleepover. We'll order tons of food. Julian's been working late anyway. You'll barely even see him. Famous last words. So I moved in, my life packed into two duffel bags that felt pathetically small. I took up residence in Sam's room, a chaotic teenage paradise of banned posters and discarded clothes. For 2 days, it was exactly as he'd promised, a comfortable blur of movies and bad food. Julian was a ghost, a pair of boots by the door in the morning, the faint scent of his soap in the upstairs hallway at night. The orbits remained stable. Then Sam got the call. His grandmother, 100 miles away, had taken a fall. He had to go. He stood in the doorway, car keys in hand, his face a mask of guilt and worry. Dude, I am so sorry. You'll be okay here, right? Julian knows you're staying. Just try not to get in his way. I nodded, a hollow feeling blooming in my stomach. Of course. Don't worry about me. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that descended was different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of an empty house. It was a held breath. It was the silence of a shared space, a territory that now had to be negotiated. I was no longer a guest of Sam. I was an intruder in Julian's domain. The house suddenly felt enormous, and I felt microscopically small within it. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an accusation. I retreated to Sam's room, my fortress within a fortress, and pulled out a book. But the words swam on the page. I was too aware of the low rumble of the refrigerator downstairs, aware of the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, aware that at any moment the weather system could come home. When I heard his truck pull into the driveway, my heart became a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. The sound of his keys in the lock was like a gunshot. I heard his boots on the floor, the heavy sigh he let out as he dropped his work bag. He was home. We were alone. The equation of my life had just been shattered, and I had no idea how to solve for this new, terrifying variable. The first 24 hours were a masterclass in mutual avoidance. I only left Sam's room for surgical strikes on the kitchen or bathroom, my ears tuned to the slightest sound that might signal his presence. I heard him moving around, the low murmur of the television, the clink of a glass. We were two ships passing in the night, in a house that suddenly felt as vast and empty as an ocean. It was pathetic, really. A grown man hiding in his friend's bedroom. I felt a flush of self-deprecating humor. Pathetic, but safe. The storm broke on the second night. Not the metaphorical storm between us, but a real one. The sky, which had been a bruised purple all day, finally split open. Rain came down in sheets, lashing against the windows. The wind howled, a mournful, angry sound that made the old house groan. It was the kind of storm that felt personal. And then the lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging the house into a sudden, shocking darkness. My breath hitched. It wasn't just dark. It was a thick, oppressive blackness, absolute and disorienting. The comforting, familiar shapes of Sam's room were gone, swallowed whole. My heart hammered against my ribs, a primal, stupid fear kicking in. I fumbled for my phone, its sudden glow, a life raft in the ink. Downstairs I heard a sharp, clattering sound, followed by a curse that was bitten off halfway through. Julian. He was down there, in the dark. My first instinct was to stay put, to wait it out. But the sound of that muffled curse, the hint of pain in it, overrode my fear. I crept out of the room, using my phone's flashlight to cut a nervous path through the hallway. Julian, I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy. Silence. Then, from the direction of the living room, yeah, I'm here. His voice was strained. I found him by the fireplace. He was on one knee, a shard of glass from a broken picture frame near his hand. He'd been trying to light the old gas hearth. Are you all right? I asked, keeping my distance. Fine, just knock this over. He gestured vaguely at the mess. But in the small, dancing light from my phone, I saw it. A dark, steady trickle of blood welling from a cut on his palm. It wasn't a small cut. "You're bleeding," I said, the words coming out flat and obvious. He glanced down, as if just noticing. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. He was the competent one, the one who fixed things. And here he was, kneeling in the dark, bleeding. For the first time, he looked breakable. "Stay there," I said, surprised by the authority in my own voice. "I know where the first aid kit is." Their mother was a nurse before she passed, and she'd kept a kit in the upstairs linen closet that was practically a field hospital. I found it, along with a handful of emergency candles, and made my way back downstairs. I lit the candles, placing them on the mantelpiece. Their flickering glow pushed back the oppressive darkness, filling the room with a soft, warm light that made everything feel intimate and strange. The shadows danced on the walls, turning the familiar living room into a secret cave. Julian hadn't moved. He was watching me, his expression unreadable in the wavering light. I knelt in front of him, my knees protesting on the hardwood floor. "Let me see," I said quietly. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then he extended his hand. I took it, and the world stopped. His hand was large, warm, and rough in mine. Calluses on his palm, a faint scent of grease, and something uniquely him, something like cedar and rain. My fingers, long and pale against his, trembled slightly as I held his hand. It was the first time we had ever touched. Really touched. And it felt like a brand. A jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot up my arm, straight to my chest, where my heart stuttered and rebooted. I focused on the task, my mind screaming at me to be normal, be clinical. I cleaned the wound with an antiseptic wipe, my touch as gentle as I could manage. He hissed in a breath through his teeth but didn't pull away. I could feel the pulse in his wrist, a steady, strong rhythm beneath my thumb. I was so close to him now. I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the single, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow. I'd seen it from a distance 1,000 times, but up close it was a tiny, perfect imperfection, a detail that made him suddenly, overwhelmingly real. He wasn't a weather system. He was just a man with a scar and a pulse and a cut on his hand. As I wrapped the gauze, my fingers brushed against his again. This time, I felt his own fingers twitch, a slight, involuntary reaction. My eyes flicked up to his. He was already looking at me. His gaze was intense, stripped of its usual guardedness. In the candlelight, his eyes looked darker, deeper. He wasn't looking at me like I was a piece of furniture. He was looking at me. I finished wrapping the bandage, my hands fumbling with the tape. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the howl of the wind and the rain against the glass. The power dynamic had been completely upended. Here I was, tending to him, the quiet observer, the caretaker, the one in control. It was a dizzying, terrifying feeling. "There," I said, my voice a whisper. I let go of his hand, and the loss of contact was a physical ache. "Thanks," he said, his voice rough. He flexed his bandaged hand, then looked around the candlelit room. "You're calm in a crisis." It was the first compliment he had ever given me. It landed in my chest like a warm stone. "My mom used to say I have a boringly low heart rate," I quipped, a weak attempt at a joke. He didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched. "There's nothing, boring about it." He didn't move away. He just stayed there, kneeling on the floor, watching me, and I stayed kneeling in front of him, caught in his orbit for the very first time. The chasm between us was still there, but in the flickering, intimate light of the storm, it seemed we had, somehow, found a bridge. We stayed like that for a long time, talking in the dark. The conversation was stilted at first, full of gaps and hesitations. We talked about the storm, about the house, about Sam, safe topics. But as the hours wore on and the candles burned lower, the walls began to come down. He asked me about my studies, about the books I was always reading. He didn't sound mocking, like I'd always imagined he would. He sounded genuinely curious. I, in turn, asked him about his work. He was a mechanic, specializing in restoring classic cars. He spoke about engines and chassis with a quiet passion that transformed his face, smoothing out the hard lines and putting a light in his eyes. He wasn't just a brute who worked with his hands. He was an artist, a craftsman. I saw a side of him I never knew existed, a side that was thoughtful and dedicated and surprisingly gentle. He told me about the scar over his eye, a bike accident when he was 16. He'd been reckless, stupid, trying to impress a girl who didn't even remember his name a year later. It was a small confession, but it felt monumental. A piece of his mythology, explained. It made him human. At some point, the chill of the house seeped into our bones. Julian got to his feet and managed to light the gas fireplace. A low, blue flame hissed to life, casting a warmer, steadier glow across the room. We sat on the floor in front of it, leaning against the couch, our shoulders not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. The space between us was alive. It hummed with unspoken things, with years of my secret longing and his... what? His indifference? His curiosity? I couldn't tell. But it wasn't hostile. The air was no longer thin. It was thick with possibility. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice low. He was staring into the flames. "For what?" "For before, yesterday, in Sam's room." My stomach did a slow, painful flip. The incident. The one I had been trying desperately to forget. The one that was seared onto the back of my eyelids. I had been getting back from a run before the storm hit, and I was changing out of my damp clothes. I was shirtless, pulling on a clean t-shirt, when the door had swung open. Julian had stood there, frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide. He was about to say something, probably asking where Sam's spare phone charger was. But the words died on his lips. His gaze had raked over me, a quick, sharp inventory that felt like a physical touch. I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Surprise. Confusion. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a shuttered mask. He'd muttered a gruff apology and backed out, pulling the door shut with a soft click. My whole body had flushed with a heat that had nothing to do with the stuffy room. Humiliation and a secret, shameful thrill had warred within me. He had seen me, not the baggy-sweatered, bookish Leo. He had seen the skin and bone underneath. Now, in the firelight, he was bringing it up. My heart hammered. This is it. This is where he makes a joke. This is where he puts the wall back up. "It's fine," I mumbled, staring at my own hands. "The lock is broken. It was an accident." "It's not fine," he insisted, turning to look at me fully. The firelight carved his face into sharp angles of light and shadow. The way I reacted, I was an ass. "You just closed the door." "Yeah, but I've been an ass for years, Leo." He said my name, not dude or man, my actual name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a tremor through me. "I don't know how to talk to people," he confessed, the words sounding like they were being pulled from him against his will. "Especially people like you." "People like me?" My voice was barely a whisper. "What does that even mean?" "Smart," he said, The word blunt and simple. Quiet. You're always thinking. I can see it. And I never know what you're thinking. I figured you hated me. Thought I was just some dumb grease monkey. The confession hung in the air between us, so raw and vulnerable it felt like a wound. All my years of careful observation, all my assumptions were wrong. My fear, which I had interpreted as his judgment, was just his own insecurity reflected back at me. He wasn't a storm. He was just afraid of the rain. I don't hate you, Julian, I said, and my voice was thick with a decade of unspoken feelings. I've never hated you. I was intimidated. I thought you hated me. A wry, sad smile touched his lips. Guess we're a couple of idiots then? The air cracked with the admission. The last barrier between us crumbled into dust. He shifted closer, the heat of his thigh a searing line against my own. My breath caught in my throat. He was so close. The firelight danced in his eyes. He smelled of soap and rain, and the faint metallic scent of his own blood. He didn't say anything else. He just looked at me, his gaze asking a question I was too terrified and too desperate to answer. He was giving me the choice. He was letting me be the one in control. My heart was a drum against my ribs, a frantic, wild thing. This is a mistake. This will ruin everything. This will break you. But the voice of my longing, the one I had suppressed for so long, was louder. It screamed one word. Yes. I leaned in. The space between us vanished. His lips met mine, and it wasn't a storm. It was the quiet after. It was hesitant, searching, and so unbelievably soft. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a question and an answer, a confession and an absolution all at once. I felt the roughness of his stubble against my skin, the surprise of his exhale against my mouth. He brought his good hand up, his fingers tangling gently in the hair at the nape of my neck. His touch was tentative, as if he were holding something infinitely precious and breakable. It sent a shiver down my entire spine. I kissed him back, pouring every ounce of my hidden, hopeless, decade-long crush into the simple pressure of my mouth against his. It was slow. It was honest. It was the most terrifying and wonderful thing that had ever happened to me. We were just two people, kneeling in the dark, finally speaking the same language. The world outside, with its rain and its wind and its expectations, ceased to exist. There was only the heat of the fire, the warmth of his hand, and the impossible, undeniable truth of his lips on mine. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. I could feel the slight tremor in his hand. He was just as scared as I was. Leo, he breathed, my name a prayer against my skin. I didn't know what to say. Words were my fortress, but they failed me now. So I just stayed there, our breath mingling in the small space between us, and let the silence say everything that needed to be said. The turning point had been reached. The orbits had not just been altered, they had collided, and I had no idea what the wreckage would look like in the morning. I woke to the unfamiliar gray light of dawn filtering into the living room. For a confused moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the candles, the confession, the kiss. Julian. We had fallen asleep on the rug in front of the fireplace, a thick blanket pulled over us. Sometime in the night I had ended up with my head on his chest, his arm draped possessively over my waist. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart beneath my ear, a comforting, solid rhythm. The fire had died down to embers, but the room was still warm. For the first time in what felt like my entire life, I felt completely and utterly safe. I lay there, not daring to move, memorizing the moment. The weight of his arm, the scent of his skin, the quiet sound of his breathing. This was impossible. This was a dream I was terrified to wake from. A fragile, perfect bubble of intimacy. Slowly, carefully, I lifted my head to look at him. In sleep, his face was unguarded. The hard lines were softened, his mouth slightly parted. The intimidating mask was gone, and all that was left was a man who looked younger, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. A fierce, protective tenderness bloomed in my chest. It was a dangerous, hopeful feeling. I let myself have one more minute of this impossible peace. And then, the house gave a shuddering groan as the power grid surged back to life. The digital clock on the cable box flashed a bright, intrusive green. A low hum started up from the kitchen as the refrigerator kicked on. The bubble burst. Julian stirred, his arm tightening around me for a moment before he blinked his eyes open. He looked at me, his expression clouded with sleep. Then recognition dawned, followed by something else, something I couldn't read. Panic? Regret? He sat up abruptly, pulling his arm away. The loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp. "Morning," he mumbled, not meeting my eyes. He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "Good morning," I said, my voice small. The easy intimacy of the night was gone, replaced by a thick, awkward tension. My anxiety, which had been blissfully dormant, woke up and began to gnaw at the edges of my fragile hope. He stood up, stretching his tall frame. He looked down at me on the floor, and his face was a mask again. The shutters were down. The fortress was rebuilt. I have to go open the shop," he said, his words clipped. "Got a car I need to finish." He didn't wait for my reply. He just turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I heard the shower turn on upstairs. I was left alone in the living room, the rumpled blanket a sad testament to a closeness that had already evaporated. A cold dread seeped into my bones. It had been a mistake, a trick of the candlelight and the storm, a moment of shared loneliness that meant nothing in the harsh light of day. My mind, my cruel, overthinking mind, started its spiral. He regretted it. He was embarrassed. He was disgusted with himself, with me. I was just Sam's weird, quiet friend, and he had a moment of weakness. I scrambled to my feet, my body aching from sleeping on the floor. I folded the blanket with frantic, jerky movements, trying to erase the evidence of what had happened. I needed to get out. I needed to go back to Sam's room, back to my fortress, before he came back downstairs, before I had to face the pity or disgust in his eyes. By the time he came down, dressed for work, I was in the kitchen pretending to be intensely interested in the contents of the refrigerator. I felt his presence behind me, a heavy weight in the air. I'll probably be back late," he said to my back. I just nodded, not turning around. I couldn't. If I saw his face, I knew my own would crumble. I heard him hesitate for a second. I willed him to say something. Anything. "Last night wasn't a mistake. I don't regret it. Talk to me." But all I heard was the jingle of his keys, and then the sound of the back door closing. I stood there for a long time, staring at a carton of milk, the cold from the open refrigerator seeping into my t-shirt. He was gone, and he had taken all the warmth from the house with him. The silence that followed was the worst I had ever experienced. It was not the quiet of solitude. It was the roar of absence. Every empty room in the house seemed to scream his name. I walked through the living room, and the spot in front of the fireplace felt like a crime scene. The memory of his lips on mine was a ghost, haunting me. A day passed, then another. He kept his word. He came home late, long after I had retreated to Sam's room, and he left early, before I was awake. We were back to being ships in the night, Only now the ocean between us was filled with the wreckage of a single, beautiful, catastrophic collision. My old solitude, once a comfort, was now a punishment. It was a constant, throbbing reminder of the connection I had held for a few brief hours and then lost. Sam came home on the third day, full of stories about his grandmother, who was recovering well. He was so happy and relieved that he didn't notice my hollowed-out expression. I tried to act normal. I played video games with him. I ate the pizza he ordered. I laughed at his jokes. It was the hardest performance of my life. Every laugh felt like a lie. Every moment of feigned normalcy was a betrayal of the chaos raging inside me. "So was it weird being here with Julian?" Sam asked, his mouth full of pepperoni. I felt my throat tighten. "No, it was fine. Barely saw him." Another lie. I had seen him more clearly than I had ever seen anyone in my life, and now I couldn't unsee him. That night, I lay awake in Sam's bed, listening. I heard Julian's truck pull in around midnight. I heard his weary footsteps on the stairs. He paused outside Sam's door. I held my breath. My heart was a frantic moth beating against my ribs. I willed him to knock, to say my name, to do something. But he just sighed, a heavy, tired sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world, and continued down the hall to his own room. The door clicked shut, and with that sound, my last stupid ember of hope died. It was over. It had never even begun. I was an idiot, a fool for thinking that a few hours in a storm could change the fundamental laws of our universe. He was the sun, and I was the forgotten moon, and I had foolishly tried to cross the sky, and I had been burned. I decided to leave the next day. My apartment wasn't ready, but I couldn't stay here anymore. The house had become a mausoleum of what might have been. I would crash on another friend's couch. I would make up an excuse for Sam. I just had to get away before the memory of that night consumed me completely. I was packing my duffel bag, my movements numb and automatic, when I heard a soft knock on the bedroom door. My heart leaped into my throat. Sam was out getting groceries. It could only be one person. "Leo," Julian's voice. It was quiet, hesitant. I froze, my hand clutching a t-shirt. I didn't answer. Maybe if I stayed silent, he would go away. The door opened anyway. He stood in the doorway, and he looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked the way I felt. His eyes landed on my open duffel bag. A flicker of something, pain, regret, crossed his face. "You're leaving," he stated. It wasn't a question. I finally found my voice. "My apartment's almost ready." The lie tasted like ash in my mouth. He took a step into the room, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded unnervingly final. "Don't lie, Leo," he said, his voice raw. "Not to me. Not anymore." I stopped packing and finally looked at him. All the anger and hurt and humiliation of the past few days rose up in me. "Why shouldn't I?" I shot back, my voice trembling. "It seems to be what we do. We lie. We pretend. We act like the other night never happened." "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "I know. And I'm so sorry." He took another step closer. I panicked. The simple, two-word confession disarmed me completely. "I woke up that morning," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor, "and I saw you there. And it was too good. It felt too right. And I don't know how to handle that. Everything I touch, everything good, I break it. I thought if I just put some distance between us, if I went back to how things were, I could protect you from me." He finally looked up, and his eyes were swimming with a vulnerability that mirrored my own. But it was worse. The silence was worse. This house, it's just a building without you in it. It's been so empty. I kept listening for you, for the sound of you turning a page in a book or making tea, and there was nothing. It was just quiet, and I realized I was a coward. I was so afraid of breaking something good that I broke it myself before it even had a chance. He was standing right in front of me now. I could see the pulse beating in his throat. I don't think you're just Sam's friend, Leo, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I think I've been half asleep for years, and that night, in the storm, when you took my hand, I woke up, and I'm so scared, but I'm more scared of going back to sleep. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and silent. I hadn't even realized I was crying. All the assumptions, all the fears I had built up in my head were just shadows. He was just as lost as I was. I thought you regretted it, I whispered. I thought you were disgusted. Never, he said, his voice fierce. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air for a moment, before he gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, wiping away a tear. His touch was electric, just like the first time. It was the realest thing that's ever happened to me. He searched my eyes, looking for an answer. Please don't leave, he whispered. And in that moment, I had a choice. I could retreat back to my fortress of solitude, back to my safe, predictable, lonely life. Or I could take the biggest risk I had ever taken. I could choose this man, with all his fears and all my own. I could choose the terrifying, wonderful possibility of a new beginning. I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. Okay, I breathed. His face crumpled in relief, and then he was kissing me again. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made and fears conquered. It was a homecoming. Later that day, after we had talked for hours, laying everything bare, he pressed something small and cold into my hand. A key. A single, shiny, newly cut key. It's for the front door, he said, his gaze steady and serious. This is your home too, Leo, if you want it to be. Not as Sam's guest. As mine. As ours. It was more than a key. It was a promise. It was an anchor. It was a tangible symbol that the recoil was over, and the recommitment was real. I closed my hand around it, the metal biting into my palm. It felt like the heaviest, most precious thing I had ever held. The days that followed felt like learning to breathe a new kind of air. The anxiety didn't vanish overnight. There were still moments of doubt, flickers of the old fear that this was too good to be true, that it would all be snatched away. But Julian was patient. He was constant. He met my fear with a quiet, steady reassurance that slowly, piece by piece, dismantled my fortress. Waking up became my new favorite part of the day. Before, it had been the start of another solitary routine. Now, it was an act of discovery. I would wake in his bed, my bed, our bed, to the solid warmth of his body next to mine. Sometimes he would already be awake, just watching me, a soft, wondering look on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. Our mornings were a quiet, domestic ballet. He would get up first and make coffee, the rich, dark scent filling the house. I would follow a few minutes later, and we would stand in the kitchen, sipping from our mugs, the silence between us no longer a weapon or a wall, but a comfortable, shared space. It was a peace I had never known. Our movements learned each other. I knew to step aside when he reached for the milk. He knew to leave my favorite mug on the counter. These small, unspoken intimacies felt more profound than any grand declaration. We ate dinner together. Sometimes we talked, sharing details of our day. Other times we ate in that same comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates. I learned that his intimidating quietness wasn't a sign of anger or judgment. It was just his natural state of rest. He was a man who was sparing with his words, which made it all the more powerful when he chose to speak. One evening, we were on the couch, me reading and him sketching in a notebook. A secret hobby I'd discovered he had, his drawings of engines and car parts, as intricate and beautiful as any piece of art. I looked up from my book and just watched him, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he chewed on the end of his pencil. The love I felt for him in that simple, mundane moment was so overwhelming, it was a physical pressure in my chest. He must have felt my gaze, because he looked up and met my eyes. He didn't say anything. He just reached out, took my book from my hands, set it aside, and pulled me into his arms. He held me, his chin resting on the top of my head, and I felt my entire body relax into his embrace. I was home. The search was over. I thought about the man I was. Before the drip in my ceiling had sent my world sideways, I had lived my life in the margins, an observer, a footnote in other people's stories. I had built my wall so high to keep out the pain that I had inadvertently locked out all the joy too. My routine wasn't a fortress, it was a prison of my own making. Julian was the disruption I never knew I needed. He was the storm that had washed away the straight lines and right angles of my life, leaving behind something more beautiful, more chaotic, and infinitely more real. He wasn't a plot twist I had to survive. He was the entire point of the story. In learning to see past the intimidating facade to the lonely, vulnerable man underneath, I had been forced to do the same for myself. I saw the quiet, anxious boy I had been and the brave man I was becoming. He had not saved me. We had saved each other. He taught me that strength wasn't about being unbreakable, but about being vulnerable enough to let someone help you bandage your wounds. I taught him that quiet didn't mean empty, and that some people could speak a whole language without ever saying a word. Lying there in his arms, with the soft light of the lamp pooling around us and the comfortable weight of his heartbeat against my ear, I knew this was my new status quo. Not a state of solitude and fear, but one of connection and courage. The future was still an unknown variable, a terrifying and exciting equation yet to be solved. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid, because I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I wouldn't be solving it alone.